I do want to hit on 3 points today, and these hopefully kind of dovetail with Evan's excellent tee-up. The first is maybe to speculate a little bit, just because it's in the news these days, this idea of what a post-INF world might look like and where we might be going with that if it's of interest. And then the second, which is a hobby horse of mine, is what do missiles mean for the U.S. military? And I think there's some really profound changes that are afoot, and I want to go into those. And then I'm going to close out by talking about just broader international security and how you contextualize missiles in a broader discussion. So with respect to post-INF, I think that there are, it's complicated whether you want to get out of the treaty or stay in it, and I would say that paradoxically, the more prepared you are to get out of it, the more likely it is that you actually could have stayed in it, and vice versa. But there's this requirement for some strategic flexibility or mental flexibility in terms of how we think about that, and that was there from the president. When I was in graduate school, I was Paul Nitz's research assistant. And we used to talk a lot about this, that the steps we took with dual track and the paradox of dual track is what led you to the negotiating table. And so I wouldn't completely give up on that today. And I'm not someone who's I don't have a union card for the arms control community, and at the same time, I'm not opposed to arms control. I think that it goes kind of hand in glove with steps that you're going to take in terms of your military force planning. So all that said, I want to start talking about the region where I think this matters most, and that's Asia, not Europe. Despite the fact that this is a bilateral treaty between the United States and Russia, what's really driving this is what's going on in the Western Pacific, that you have this highly asymmetric situation. China's been going gangbusters for 20 years, building up land-based INF-class ballistic and cruise missiles. And there's been really no redress by the United States or its allies in the Western Pacific. So I think here, more than any other place in the world, INF-class systems on the part of the United States and its allies probably make some sense. And I was thinking through, what do you do with them? And here's what I'd throw out as food for thought. I mean, the first I think is Evan got into where we're going, and one of the trend lines we see is that the idea of just cooking off one Roman candle is not very interesting anymore. It's going to become a salvo competition. This requires a lot better battle management, both on the part of the offense in terms of how in the past we talk about one of the principles of warfare is concentration of your forces, and we always really assume that that's done in terms of concentration in geospace. What we're really talking about with the salvo is concentration in time. So within a short time window, I have to be able to synchronize, coordinate, and launch effectively some reasonable salvo that can saturate or overwhelm the defenses of the adversary. So that's kind of an interesting problem. So one of the things I would say is that INF class systems deployed by the United States and its allies could help me in terms of counter salvo or what we would have called in the past counter battery. But my ability to screw you up at the tactical level in terms of you are more conscious of the fact that there's a hypersonic system that's coming after you, or that I have something with pretty short time of flight that can get to you before you're able to pack up and haul ass out of wherever you are to get to your next high site. And so I've got probably a window of opportunity that's measured in minutes, order of magnitude, 10 to the first, in which I can affect your calculations and screw up your salvo. That's not a silver bullet, but it does buy me something in terms of it takes some of the pressure off my integrated air and missile defenses, because that's the other part of this, is the defensive missile part. And how do I use those systems more effectively and essentially work at winnowing down that salvo that I face at each step. I think the second area that looks really attractive is really just kind of copycatting what the Chinese are doing, which is the Chinese, there were two interpretations on Desert Storm. One was the American one, which is these PGMs and having Stu-3s and satellite communications. This stuff we're just going to overlay like peanut butter across our whole joint force, and it's just going to make us more awesome at everything. We were totally wrong. The Chinese looked at it and said, well, number one, we've just been vicariously defeated. All this Warsaw Pact crap doesn't work terribly well. Static defenses don't work terribly well. But this PGM stuff's really interesting, not for the offense, for doing kind of transoceanic power projection the way the Americans fantasize about, but for stopping transoceanic power projection. This is how we break tip fits. This is how we break S-pods and A-pods.
Could you not use acronyms? What do those things mean?
Air and sea points of debarkation. And tip fit is a time-phased force deployment data, which is basically the logistics flow into a theater.
Now, I have to say, I still don't know what that means, but I'm impressed that you knew what each one of those letters meant.
Well, let me just back up and say, they're focused on breaking our logistics en route, and there are two choke points, classes of choke points when you go into a theater in expeditionary warfare. You're going to either go through an airport or you're going to go through a seaport. And I'm planning on taking missiles and smashing the hell out of both of those classes of targets. And if you do that, and if we're not already in theater, you can win by fait accompli. And so that's really the point. So I think the Chinese got this right, and I think the Americans fundamentally got the diagnosis of Desert Storm wrong. So I am a dyed-in-the-wool, groupie when it comes to PLA doctrine. I think these guys are really good. And all I can say is, if you can't beat them, join them. So how do we adopt our own kind of friendly A2AD or our own friendly counter power projection? And their missiles are going to figure prominently. But one of the best things I can use them for is counter maritime power projection. So you have what John Mearsheimer and Evan would call the stopping power of water. I want to use that to my advantage. And in the first island chain, in the far western Pacific, it's hard to move at more than about 40 knots by sea, and those are generally going to be ships with very high signatures that I can hold at risk with missile forces. I can do what the second artillery or the PLA rocket force is called blockades by fire. So I can influence your shipping, not only in terms of naval shipping, but also commercial shipping. If you're an aspiring maritime power, this not only poses problems for you in the current conflict, if we were in a war, but it holds out the prospect that you may not have a navy or you may not have a commercial fleet when the war is over, which sets you back over the next quarter century as you try to rebuild that. I think holding the fleet at risk is the low-hanging fruit. That's the easiest thing we can get at, and I think missiles are ideally suited for that. And then the third thing I was thinking about is kind of picking up on Evan's point earlier. We said, missiles are awesome. We can, what Bob Work has said is, we can achieve accuracy independent of range, but we can't achieve range independent of cost. And the longer range your missile is, the more it costs. I just saw a figure for thinking about like ground-based strategic deterrent. You're looking in the probably low $100 million figure versus an IRBM like a DF-21D, you're probably at about 10 million. So that's a big step function increase to go from an IR to an IC. But one of the things that occurs to me then, if missiles are relatively expensive against aircraft, and if bombers for efficiency are just kind of the most cost-effective way of dropping a lot of stuff on somebody, one of the things you want to use your missiles for, and this is kind of the third mission I'd highlight, is offensive counter-air. But I want to go smash air bases, and I want to keep them down over time. This is what the Chinese are thinking about with the counter-intervention strategy, holding Kadena at risk, holding potentially Anderson at Guam at risk, and things like that. We would want to think about something similar. Of course, you've got to do all of this recognizing that, for big powers, they probably have nuclear weapons as well. So there's this Goldilocks problem in terms of how hard you actually hit somebody before they get angry. And that's a really big concern in this missile competition.
But but things go well until then, right?
Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah. But it's a serious concern on all sides. And it's one that, it's impossible to have a discussion about any sort of conventional conflict without thinking about the super conventional, including nuclear, as well as the subconventional of how do I just skirt all of this and use my Spetsnaz or use my active measures or whatever I'm going to do and just kind of go underneath all of these things where you can't compete effectively. So the really interesting thing is if you buy into, maybe we have an interest in these missions, where would you put this stuff? And there are going to be real concerns on the part of your allies. Behind closed doors, the Japanese will kind of flirt with this and say, maybe one day. But we're having a hard enough time just getting just regular old F-22s and F-35s out of Kadena and moving them to the main islands of Japan. This is a much bigger lift. If you had a government in the Philippines that we were on pretty good terms with, Luzon looks like an awesome place to have missiles. Palawan looks like an awesome place to have missiles, even as far as Mindanao. but more likely you're probably going to be in the second island chain initially. And there, you've got some serious distance limitations, but it's worth at least thinking about. I think the even more interesting thing is what might the Russians do? So if you're out of INF, and I'll get to this point in a second talking about Europe, but in some ways, I think the earliest Russian deployments of anything would actually be in the Eastern Military District, not the Western Military District. And so I think that's actually, we could go around and around in a conversation and I'm sure somebody will disagree with me on this point, but it would be interesting to have that conversation. Conscious of time, let me move ahead real quick and just say on Europe. I think deploying INF-class systems in Europe by either on the part of Russia or on the part of the United States makes a lot less strategic sense than an Asian deployment. I think the disincentives in Europe are pretty strong for both of the main protagonists. For the U.S., it's a lack of allied support, not in my backyard, and we just have an immediate lack of weapons. That there's some time lag in terms of we don't really have our act together for getting out of INF in some ways. I think the second is when it comes to Russia, that I think Russia is much more cost sensitive. That the opportunity costs are even higher in terms of their resource constraints, but also it's a fear of response in kind. I mean, it really is kind of deja vu all over again when you go back to the 1980s and you think about dual track in both Pershing II and Griffin deployments on the part of the United States Air Force and Army. That the Russians just look and say, you got short time of flight to my capital, and I don't have that's a favorable asymmetry for you. I would much rather go back to the bargaining table at that point. So I don't think that has changed particularly. And Will probably knows better than anybody in this room some of that. Maybe we could talk to that after in the discussion. To the extent that you would think about these things, Russia, I think, is most concerned with NATO air bases and with ballistic missile defense sites, Aegis ashore in Europe, and how those could be held at risk. But I think actually Russia has other options besides missiles for how it might deal with and address some of those concerns. And for the United States, I think our principal interest is going to be shorter range missile forces in Europe for air and sea denial, as well as for counter battery. And so that's how I would think about the mission sets in each of the theaters.